Is that I'll get to what I handed out in just a little bit. It's on D2L as well, so you can find it under outlines on D2L, so you'll find that there. This is on D2L. I'm not handing this out, it's on D2L. You can look at it there. But I want you to have that one in your hands because I think that one is better to have in front of you, to look at, and scroll on, how long can someone be, all that kind of stuff. So it might be useful to you in that regard, so I thought it would be better because we're going to go through the text pretty carefully today, latter part of the day, that hopefully that handout will help a bit with. So I'll get to that in a little bit. The thing to note though is that just to remind you that the exegetical paper, the only assignment you have for this class, the exegetical paper is due on the 25th of November. I know that's like 23 days or whatever, 20 days away, I forget what we are. I know it sounds like a long way away. It's not. If you haven't picked one of the passages, now's the time to do so. Remember, I'm asking you to do two things with the passage. You pick one passage, right? Not any more than that. I'm asking you to do two things with it. One is tell me what that passage says, and as best you can tell, non-Hegelian language, right? So give me back as best you can in your language. I know sometimes my lecture language will be mixed in with that. That's absolutely fine. That's why you have the benefit of coming to lectures. So use that, try to make it your own. And so tell me what it says. Then secondly, tell me, oftentimes it's the conclusion to an argument, it's got an argument built into it, reconstruct the argument, right? So if it's the conclusion, reconstruct the argument that leads to it. Please, I've already been asked this many times, and rightly so, does that mean we need to go all the way back to being, right? The very start of the book. The answer is no. Reconstruct only that portion you need to get to that claim. So think about what the claim is saying. So start with the assignment, what is it saying? And then ask yourself, okay, what does Hegel claim that leads him to make that claim, right? And I'll give you what Hegel claims, right? Because you can't demonstrate and prove everything. That would be rewriting the entirety of the science of logic. I'm not assigning that to you. That was not the assignment. So if you find yourself sort of drifting into, wait a minute, I think I need to reconstruct everything for being up to this, you're mistaken. Please do not do that. You will not finish it, and I need you to finish it. It's a much more restricted, confined assignment than that. Really, it's an exercise, right? So think of it as that. You're not writing me a paper. Remember, no secondary sources as a result of that. We'll do all sorts of secondary sources for the second, for the paper you write for me if you choose to stay on in the winter quarter. But that's the assignment for this quarter, right? It's due on November 25th. That's Monday, November 25th, 11:59 p.m. D2L midnight. We're going to get in before then. There's a submission folder on D2L. Put it there. I'll note that you have it there. Don't send me requests asking for extensions because no is the answer, right? Put there whatever you have at 11:59 p.m. on November 25th. Put whatever you have in that folder. Right? That's what you need to do. If you want me to look at drafts of it, I'll be glad to do that. If you have questions going along towards it, I'll be glad to do that. Note that next week is the last time I'll actually be holding regular office hours, regular Tuesday office hours. And I already have an appointment for them. But if you'd like to come see me, please send me a request. I'll make it work. I'll also be here on Friday in person, right, for the talk. So if you need to see me in person Friday, I'll be here for that. If you want to meet with me on Zoom, I can absolutely do that as well. So there are several ways that we can talk about what you're writing if you need to do that, right? If you need to do that. I appreciate that, you may not need to do that. If you want to see me after class tonight, you can certainly do that as well. All right, does that make sense? Questions, issues, problems about that assignment? My goal is to have you focus on something fairly narrow and to work hard on that skill. That's what the assignment is trying to do. So I know the anxiety is there to say, well, this is really difficult. Yeah, I know that. It's hard to say things in non-Hegelian language that Hegel says. I know that, trust me. I struggle with that every week or so. So, that's difficulties. I understand it's the challenges. But if you'll work hard on that and try to do that, you'll do what I need you to do. You'll do the skill, you'll build the skill that you need to, the skill of exegesis. It's really hard. Right? It's hard not only in Hegel, it's hard in a lot of other philosophers as well. And you need to hone that skill, work on that skill in this particular setting. That's what I'm looking for you to do. So I want to try to, by saying that, reduce some of the anxiety, right, that comes naturally along with that assignment. I get it. So just reduce some of the anxiety, put yourself into it, do it as well as you can, and then let it go. Let it go. Because it's not going to get better by you, looking at it. It's not going to get better by leaving it in front of you on the, we've all tried this, right? On the computer screen in front of us, you go, oh, I think that's going to become genius in a minute. No, it doesn't do that. You have to actually do stuff for it. Well, we all know that. So the better thing for you to do is to let go of it. We're all perfectionists. We have trouble doing this, but here's where you got to do it. Make sense? Questions, problems, issues about that assignment? All right. then what I want to do by way of review is talk about some things we've talked about in the class before, obviously. But then the main focus of today will be on the actuality chapter. So what I've done in these last couple of sessions for this quarter, and as you'll see if you look at next quarter, the first session of next quarter, is I've kind of put on the brakes at the end of the quarter. Right? But what I mean by that is we get to actuality, and I just want to stop and settle in here for 2-3 weeks, frankly, because this chapter is that important. Right? This is a kind of, we've been tracking Hegel along through this account, right? We've been seeing what being is and essence is, and I'm about to redo a kind of overarching diagram of that, and we'll talk through that and all that sort of wonderful stuff. But the actuality chapter is kind of a plateau in the book, right? It's where you where you come to a culmination of Hegel's account of, okay, what's the nature of being? Now, it's not the final answer, it's a plateau, right? It's not the final answer about it, that we can get in the subjective logic. But it is an important answer. It's important to get the plateau to see kind of where things are at. You should be able to walk out of the next couple of weeks. I didn't say out of today, right? But out of the next couple of weeks, you should be able to walk out and say, here's the way the world is for Hegel. Right? This is the account of the world he's laying out before us. All questions won't be answered by that. Trust me, right? Even the ones that Hegel thinks need to be answered won't be answered by that, right? That's why the subjective logic comes after this. But we'll at least begin to have some idea of why the subjective logic does what it purports to do. Whether it does it successfully and how it does it is another matter. But we will have some sense about that. That's the goal of this session and the next session. So it's important to focus down and stop for a bit and settle down and work on these passages fairly closely. I'm going to take you through, as I said just a moment, this is what the handout is as an aid for. So I'm going to take you through one of those sections, paragraph by paragraph, line by line, because it deserves it, right? And it's a mess. It's hard, it's difficult. I'm not saying it's all so simple. You've read it. So if you walked away from those passages going, those pages going, I have no clue whatsoever. There's a lot of talk about necessity. There's a lot of talk about contingency, and there's a lot of talk about actuality and possibility, but I have no clue about all that modality stuff, and let alone all the causality stuff. You're okay. Right? We're going to do the modality stuff this week, we do the causality stuff next week. So we'll work hard on those passages there. Now, before I get to that, I want to bring us back to a couple of things I've mentioned along the way. I mentioned them both last week. I mentioned one of them last week, principally. But I want to come back and just recall us of two of the things we talked about very early on in the quarter, and just ask us to get a reading of where we're at with those, right? Just a reading of where people are at with these issues. And those two issues I want to bring back are the project of the science of logic. What is the project of this book? What's he doing in this book? Which is a good question to ask at this point, because we're all terribly confused. It's a confusing book, so we ask the question, what the hell's going on here? What did he think he was trying to do in this book, let alone whether he was successful? It's a whole other matter. So the project of the science of logic. And then the second is about these critiques, the fundamental critiques, Schelling's double deception in particular. So I just want to come back and reflect upon those. I'll expand that second one a little bit to include some things we have been talking a little bit about, but I'll try to integrate it more and talk a bit more directly about some critiques of the project overall. And then we'll come to do a little bit of review. I'll do a kind of overview like we've done before, and that should lead us into talking about then actuality, which will be our main focus. Make some sense? Questions about that? Issues? So let's come back to the project of the science of logic. So in our reading of the science of logic, I have contended that in this text, Hegel is systematically deducing the fundamental elements of what I believe is best termed a genuinely post-critical, post-Kantian metaphysics. So more fully, I believe the text bears out the claim that Hegel's post-critical metaphysics is at its core a process ontology of immanent differentiation. We'll hear obviously some about that today, but more about that as we move along. I think you've seen the process thing come up several times. Differentiation has been incredibly important. I'm just trying to put things together at that point. The other term you could use for that is determinate negation. It's another process of immanent differentiation is another term for that would be determinate negation. Now, as I noted at the beginning of the seminar, by post-critical metaphysics, I mean an account of the nature of reality, so metaphysics, and specifically of being as such, being qua being, so ontology in particular, that's what you're getting here. You're not getting all of metaphysics here. You're not getting special metaphysics, as it's called. You're getting metaphysics to core. You're getting metaphysics at the level of being, qua being, ontology. And that ontology has demonstrated that such knowledge, that is knowledge of the absolute, knowledge of being, qua being, is justified against any and all skeptical challenges, whether the challenge be from hypothesis or infinite regress or circularity. So the standard sort of skeptical challenges to such knowledge, Hegel thinks himself to have already demonstrated. He's not demonstrating that in this book. He takes himself that to be the work of the phenomenology or the work of committing ourselves to abstract thinking, right? So, right? Pure thought, as he calls it. Right? So that's a task dealt with, not in this book, but taken as already grappled with and solved before this book. That's the problem we address with what must the science begin? Right? What are the pathways into this science? With what must the science begin? Either the phenomenology provides that pathway into it, or simply the resolve to think without presuppositions provides that pathway into it. Either one of which has dealt with that question of, can we actually know the absolute? So that's the perspective we've been reading the text from. But let me back out and remind you that that's not the only way of reading this text. So let me just recall for a moment the as I call them, the hermeneutic paradigms. I want to recall two of them in particular about approaching this text and thinking about what it does. So what does it really mean to say that the science of logic is a post-critical metaphysics? Hegel says that what he's doing in the book is what he calls, this is what he calls it in the introduction, and he also calls it, comes back to this term in the encyclopedia and it uses a variant of this. He says, what I'm talking about in this book is objective thinking. Objective thinking. He says in the encyclopedia, this is paragraph 25 in the 2730 edition of the encyclopedia, he calls it objective thoughts. The subject matter of the science of logic is objective thoughts. And I want to latch onto that expression for just a moment because it's awkward in English just like it is in German, right? It's almost a contradiction, flat out. How are thoughts objective, right? How can objectivity be about thoughts? Aren't thoughts in the fleeting realm of the mental, and objectivity is out in the real world? So how can those two have anything to do with one another? What could it mean to be a book be dedicated to something called objective thinking, to be about objective thoughts? Well, one way you can take that is the way in which we've tried to take it here, and that's think about it in terms of, well, those thoughts are not just thoughts in the mind, right? So the categories of being, nothing, becoming, quality, quantity, measure, essence, everything else that's in the book, all the categories of the logic, they're not just thoughts in the mind, they are thoughts in the mind. But not just thoughts in the mind, they're objective thoughts. They're thoughts about the nature of reality that capture the nature of reality. Always have to be careful about the about, because then it makes it sound like it's pointing out, from the mind out to something outside it. It's actually captured the nature of reality itself. It's not referring to it. It's not representing it. It's the other way to put that, right? It has actually captured the nature of reality itself. That's what it means to talk about objective thinking. That's a systematic metaphysical approach, the one we've been taking in this class. But you can also take that phrase, objective thinking, objective thoughts, and say, no, that's not what, you're not doing metaphysics in the old school style of metaphysics, even its post-Kantian variation. What you're doing here is you're really doing the Kantian project in this way. You're talking about objective thoughts, and what you mean by objective thoughts is the thoughts that are necessary in order for things to be objective for us. Now that's the systematic non-metaphysical reading of the text, right? So they would say, being, nothing, becoming, quality, quantity, all the categories of the logic are fantastic, wonderful categories to have, but they're all just the categories that are necessary in order for us to think objectivity. Whether that is objectivity, open question. But for us to think it, we have to think it through being, nothing, in precisely the ways we've just been unpacking in this text. So, in a sense, the systematic non-metaphysical would agree with everything we've done, right, in this text up to this point. They really, they might differ here about some interpretive point here or there or whatnot, sure. But the thing that really divides the systematic metaphysical from the systematic non-metaphysical is the existential import of the categories. The existential import of the categories. Are they actually drawing the joints and junctures of being, or are they not? Are they are they giving an account of the joints and junctures of being, the Platonic sense of joints and junctures of being? Are they giving an account of that's actually out there in the world? So it's real? Or is this just what it is for us to experience the world as objective? Kant would always say the categories are the conditions of the possibility of experience, but experience really means for him, right, how objects are given to us. And here are the conditions under which that is possible. Are they that way in themselves? Got no clue. Agnostic completely about the noumenal. You can think it, but you can't know it. And it looks like you can read Hegel, the science of logic, you can say all of this wonderful, intricate, maybe not so wonderful, intricate account of these concepts and how they entail one another, even if they all work, ultimately give us a web of categories that constrain our thinking about reality, but aren't actually capturing the nature of reality itself. There's no guarantee of that. Now that's the systematic non-metaphysical approach. That's why they would say they're non-metaphysical. They're not laying out an account of the nature of reality. They're laying out an account of the nature of what things must be to make sense for us. It's always reference to us. You can always tell this is how the systematic non-metaphysical always runs. They'll say, that's all true, insofar as that's how we have to experience things. That's how it's true for the conditions of how we know things, think about things. It's always referenced back to us. The systematic metaphysical will always say, no, that's how things are in themselves. So the difference is really the existential import of the categories, but the existential import of the categories is all hinged on, based on, predicated on, is thought really one with being, or is it not? Because in the systematic non-metaphysical approach, thought and being are not necessarily one. You don't know if thought and being are one. You can't know that. This is the Kantian position still. It's still a subjective idealism, put it in those terms. So it's still about our relationship to the world as being open, right? Subject-object divide is still there, or is it something we actually know directly? Now, Hegel thinks, right, this is the problem for the the systematic non-metaphysical approach. Hegel thinks that he wrote a book called The Phenomenology of Spirit that addressed that question and showed us that we actually do know the absolute, not the absolute for us, right? Absolute knowing is not absolute knowing, as best we can get it. Right? There's no caveats in that chapter, in that chapter of The Phenomenology of Spirit. He doesn't say, well, our best approximation. None of that is there, because he doesn't think that's true. He thinks you're knowing the absolute, the absolute, like the in itself. So Hegel thinks that what he's doing in this book, I think, is not still abiding by the epistemological divide between the mind and the world. But this is an account of how the world is and the mind is, because they are both structured in by the same set of categories. So we think in terms of being, nothing, becoming, and everything that follows from that, because that's the nature of reality, not because that's our nature. It's not an anthropology, which is what that is about us. It's an ontology. It's the nature of reality. So that's the distinction, right? Objective thoughts, where you lay the emphasis on thoughts, you say, well, it's really about thoughts and their objectivity, and what's the conditions of the possibility of things being objects for us. That's the systematic non-metaphysical reading. Or is it objective thoughts? The emphasis is on objective. Where are people at with that? Does it make at least some sense, that divide? What do you think about the text? You've heard me rant on about, obviously, a systematic metaphysical. You buying that at all? Yeah.
Well, so what are the grounds for the systematic non-metaphysical reading? I mean, I don't know if I've just been poisoned by Holgate and now you, I guess, but it seems so apparently there. Yeah. It seems so apparent almost on the surface of the text that I'm having a hard time really maybe being hermeneutically charitable to the alternative reading. So what do they point to? What are the arguments?
So I don't know if they point to arguments. They point to what they would call, I'm trying to get their language right. I don't want to misportray their language. Philosophical cogency. Let's stay with that one. They don't think that if we read Hegel as a metaphysician, they don't think that that's salvageable. Because then he's making claims about the nature of reality. And we're just not up to the task. As human beings, the finite mind is just not up to the task of making claims. Those are grandiose, godlike claims that we shouldn't be making about ourselves. If anything, post-Hegelian, pre-Hegelian, Kant taught us this, we ought to be more humble than that, right? So this is often called Kantian humility. We can't know the end itself because who do we think we are? And I'm paraphrasing, that's not literal Kant. Kant had a 14-page sentence that says that, but Kant can't be read as saying, human, we need to be humble before the end itself. We can't know it itself. So that's where it comes from. So to make Hegel be able to speak to a world in which we don't think we can say things about the end itself, that we can make proclamations about the absolute, that's the tenor of our times, then you have to read him in this way. To do so, to not do so, would be to mire him back in either pre-critical dogmatic metaphysics, or at best, a kind of post-critical metaphysics that is still saying you can know things as they are in themselves when we don't look like we've got the warrant to make such claims as that. So it's an epistemic challenge, if you want to put it that way. It's not really an argument, it's an epistemic limitation, right, that they're working from. So, you know, one variation of this is, well, there's several variations of this. They're all committed to this, the humility claim, as I put it, that we can't know the end itself. Yeah, Carol.
I think this is directly following up on what Alex said, but I'm wondering what they do with that claim insofar as like that exactly seems to be what that of like rejecting the uncognizable thing in itself seems to be what a lot of the argumentation of the logic is about. So I guess I'm wondering like how they deal with those like very frequent passages in Hegel, and like if it's they're seeing it as like this sort of revision they need to make in order to make it cogent, or what, like specifically about those passages that bring up the arbitrariness of the distinction between the thing itself and the for us and so on.
Yeah, so I appreciate that. I mean, what they want to do is they want to say those passages are there. They're not denying the passages are there. They're not ignorant, right? They've read the text, and they oftentimes read it extraordinarily well. But they think those passages are moments where Hegel's trying to overstep his own best insights. So it's his own extremes, right? So they don't deny he thought this. Right? It's not the case they think Hegel, the philosopher, thought that you could know the absolute. They absolutely agree. Yeah, of course he did. He did that. But is that the best reading of, philosophical reading of this text? And they think his own insights bar him from making those kinds of claims, even though he makes them. Right? So they're trying to save him from himself, is the way they think of it at that point. In order for, you know, for the historical, for the contemporary relevance of this philosophy. Is that help with that? Because I mean, we're going to hit one of these. It's not about the in itself and the for itself stuff, but we're going to hit one where he's going to say today in the opening of the Actuality chapter, he's talking about the absolute. And one moment he says, "No, I'm talking about the absolute, just to ratchet it up, right? I'm not just talking about the absolute, like we normally think about the absolute. Right? You can't know that absolutely. I'm talking about the absolute, which would have to include this." So those kind of passages, they want to tone back, restrain back, and say, well, he's not talking about the absolute. He's talking about the absolute for us. Right? What's ultimate in terms of human cognizability. That's what all those passages need to be evidence. Is that useful?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess then really quickly that would bring up the question of like how they at the same time are interested in viewing his, like the systematicity of his thought, like sort of in light of that, but that would be a further rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah.
Other questions or comments? Yeah, Ken.
I mean, my question was along similar lines, but I guess now I'd ask for maybe not a concrete example, but to what degree are they able to make interpretive claims that refute a metaphysical reading? Because it seems very difficult, because they're bringing this epistemological concern to Hegel's project, which, you know, we might say based off our reading is that they're not, you know, they don't actually have the justification to do that. They're bringing something else into it about what they think philosophy is demanded of into a system that explicitly kind of forbids them from doing that, at least at the beginning of, or at the outset of that project. But what does it look like to respond to a metaphysical reading of Hegel for them? Is it always depend on this epistemological question of it's like you don't have the right to speak about the in itself, or can they make an actual hermeneutically interpretive claim out of Hegel that justifies that position?
So I'm going to cite two bits of evidence. There are more that they would appeal to, right? But let me cite two bits of textual evidence that they have gone to repeatedly. I say they. This is really Robert Pippin, who's the best of those readers in my view. And he's gone to both of these sites to make this case that he wants to make about this. Although he would now say he's doing metaphysics, right? But he doesn't mean metaphysics by what we mean by metaphysics. So, yeah. Okay. The two sites he would go to is the account of reflection. And the second site he would go to, textual site he would go to, is the account of the concept, where Hegel says about the concept, this is in the section we'll read next quarter, called The Concept of the Concept, where he says, if you want to know what the concept is, look at what Kant meant by the transcendental unity of apperception. So what he wants to do is take both of those, the latter more so than the former, frankly, but he wants to read both of them as moments within Hegel's text where Hegel acknowledges the dependency of the account on subjective activities. So he wants to read reflection not as a movement of being, but as a movement of the mind. He wants to read, because Hegel says so, that the concept is, I'm going to worry about this because it's not what Hegel says, but Hegel says, this is the way he reads it, that the concept is the transcendental unity of apperception. Well, if you allow those two things to be the case, those to be subjective moments in the text, then the dependency of all these categories on the mind, in particular the apperceptive nature of the mind, right, that we know ourselves in knowing anything, right, that we're always self-related in knowing anything, then you can say, well, these are the conditions of apperception. These are the conditions of self-consciousness, is another way of putting that. And that's the way in which the systematic non-metaphysical reading has tried to ground itself textually and make the case for, even though Hegel may say things to the contrary, these are moments in his own text where he's clearly rooting the account he's providing in a reference to subjectivity, the broad sense, right? He's not turning it into subjectivism, right? It's not Berkeley idealism all of a sudden. Sorry, he always gets the bad rap, but that's the way it works. But so it's really about that. These moments of subjectivity in what purports to be an ontology. It looks like there is these moments of, well, that's how it is for us. We reflectively need essences to make sense of the measurelessness of being. That's us, right? We have that need. So we reflect out of being and posit essences in respect to that. That's our reflection. We did that. Similarly, what is this thing called the concept? Well, the concept just is the transcendental unity of apperception. What does that mean in Kant? Long story, but let's keep it brief. That whenever I experience something, I always attach the I think to it, right? There's always me there experiencing it. Well, that means it's always self-referential, not me individually, but consciousness, subjectivity. The mind is always, so everything's mind-dependent in this way. And Pippin will say, well, right, that's a recognition that the concept, if it's, broadly speaking, the ground of everything, problematic term, we all know, using this language of ground, I'll use it as well, so I'm not faulting him on it. But if it's the ground of all things, if it is the ultimate truth of being and essence, which is Hegel's claim, then it looks like everything ultimately hinges on the movement of not some ontological process, but actually on the activity of the human mind. So you get a version of the Kantian deduction, B deduction in particular, but the deductions arguments where Kant says that if you want to understand the categories, there are rules for the construction of the human mind by which the human mind constructs the world. That's a quick take on the argument that you see. If you want to see this in Pippin, I think it's really brilliantly done. It's in Hegel's Idealism, his book called Hegel's Idealism, and I highly, highly recommend that book. I disagree with it profoundly, but I love that book because for me, this is true of Pippin in general, but let's keep it to just that book. It poses all the right questions. It doesn't always pose them in the ways I think you ought to pose them, right? Okay, fine. Because it commits itself in the posing of those questions sometimes to one way or another, fine. But man, does he know how to ask the right questions. And some of his interpretations are really brilliant. They're spot on, I love them. I disagree profoundly with that text, but I highly, highly recommend it, particularly the second half of it, which is on Hegel's logic. So I highly recommend that. I think I put that in the syllabus, but anyway. Ken, you have
a brief follow-up, this is probably getting into more than we need to, but in terms of, I don't know, making heads or tails or squaring that particular interpretive paradigm coming out of the logic in terms of the relationship between it all being mind-dependent or its subjective base.
Yeah.
So how does that, what relation does that bear to a potential reading of the phenomenology of spirit then?
So this has always perplexed me. The other part of Pippin's book, by the way, I should say, is a reading of the phenomenology, right? And it's ultimately about what the phenomenology is giving us is insights on apperception. And so the whole book turns around apperception. Right? That's the central thesis in the book for a lot of purposes. And it does not read the phenomenology in the way that people who are in the systematic metaphysical side read the phenomenology. The phenomenology has a purpose. It's to show that we are warranted in having absolute knowledge. It's just literally not how the systematic non-metaphysical side reads it. They read it as a treatise in insights into apperceptive nature of consciousness. But we don't know the in itself, because you don't know the itself. You know how we relate to ourselves. You know how subconsciousness operates. That's their read of the phenomenology in broad terms, right? Other comments about that? Just wanted to bring that back and let you think about that. Yeah, Nate.
I guess a more particular push on that is thinking of how Pippin characterizes the opening of the logic, of failing to think being and then failing to think nothing.
Yeah. Which is a failure of thought.
It's a failure of thought to think those, yes. How, I guess, the question I'm looking for is, does he respond to the charge anywhere that maybe like slips into parts of the slips back into parts of the phenomenology that posit like a clean subject-object divide or something like that?
So this is about Pippin, right? He acknowledges that the treatment of the opening of the logic, any moment in the logic, frankly, but that's a good one as an example of it, that on his reading comes dangerously close, if it's not the same thing as a psychological reading of the text, right? Because the problem is, right, as we said, it's about thinking being, right? Thinking, that forces you to think nothing, and then you can't think nothing, so that forces you to think the two together, and that forces you to think becoming. But notice it's all relative to the problem's us, right? The problem's the human mind. It's not the nature of reality. We don't know a damn thing about the nature of reality. The problem's with us, right? We can't make the things work together. And that looks like it psychologizes a text that really doesn't have those kind of references, right? Hegel doesn't say, when we try to think being. In fact, in 1831, when he goes back and revises the text, he tries to eliminate all that reflective language, right? Because he knows even when I wasn't committed to it, it's still largely, it seeps through sometimes, and I do articulate the points in those terms. Well, the 1831 one, you've got the translation you're working with, he's trying to eradicate all that language. So I think it's a real, I don't know, I've never seen him successfully try to deal with that, right? Even in the book on, this is Hegel's Realm of Shadows, the Pippin's book on the logic, he wants to say, we'll have more to talk about this when we, next quarter, but he wants to say the fundamental activity of consciousness is judging, which is absolutely true for Kant. It's not true for Hegel. And if it's judging, then it's the apperceptive nature judging. We're the judger in the moment of judging. So all these categories are then the moment. It's very Kantian reading of how you do this. But it doesn't work for the text terribly well, because Hegel doesn't say that. Right? He doesn't think the fundamental activity is that of judging. We'll see what he thinks. Right? He does have a point about this, but it's not judging. So is that useful at all?
Yeah.
Yeah, well.
So you said that when you were answering Alex's question, you said that the systematic non-metaphysical reading is justifying itself by saying that appealing to coherence and to a sort of Kantian humility. So since that Kantian humility is addressed towards pre-critical metaphysics,
right,
not post-critical metaphysics, do you think that kind of problem that those people are having has to do with, like, would be solved if they understood the difference and how post-critical metaphysics is different from? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. The answer, I think, is no, because as I tried to say, systematic non-metaphysical readers are brilliant. Right? They're not stupid. And they know what the difference is between pre-critical and post-critical metaphysics is. They know it very, very well. They just don't think that that's a tenable reading of any of that material for a contemporary audience. When you live in a world in which the general tenor is non-metaphysical or anti-metaphysical, non-foundationalist, anti-foundationalist, all those are kind of put together, then you're trying to make Hegel, I'm going to put loaded words in here, so let me just acknowledge those, right? So please don't say this is what they say, because they don't put it this way. When you're trying to domesticate Hegel, this is what happens, right? So it's not really, it's not really about the concern that you're thinking about. Oh, they just missed what is the post-critical metaphysics. They know exactly what that is, but they just, because they think, they will acknowledge quite often that that's what Kant took himself to be doing ultimately. That's why the metaphysics of morals is called the metaphysics of morals, the metaphysics of natural science, the metaphysics, he thought he was doing metaphysics, right? Ultimately, that's not what the critiques are doing, but they're preparing the way for metaphysics. They know that very well. They're good scholars, they understand that. They know that Schelling and others were trying to do metaphysics, post-critical metaphysics. But the problem with that is they think it's not tenable to do that.
Does that imply that you think that post-critical metaphysics in Hegel is not constructed in such a way that it addresses those concerns of Kantian humility?
I think it purposely is, but it's not, this is not the text for it.
Not right in the phenomenology.
Right? The phenomenology is the text for that,
Yeah.
right? Because that text, as far as I know, is predicated on the idea of must we be humble? I'm massively paraphrasing. Must we be so humble to say we don't know the absolute? Because he starts off the book by saying the presumption we operate with is that subjectivity can never get to objectivity. Must we be so humble? We can't know the absolute as it is in itself. We can only know it as it is for us. And Hegel says, I don't know, let's try. That's literally, I mean, we often characterize the first critique as a kind of experiment, right? I don't know if we'll make any progress in metaphysics if we try this other route, right, where we go think the world must conform to us, not us to the world, but let's see. Well, there's a bit of that in the phenomenology where Hegel is saying, I don't know that we know the absolute, but let's see if we do. I mean, we actually tried that out. I know Kant told us we couldn't, but telling us that we couldn't is not demonstrated that we can't. It's just put forward an assertion. Have we actually tried that assertion out? And so that's, I take it as what, it's an internal refutation of the skepticism, right, argument. This is why he says it's a thoroughgoing skepticism. The phenomenology is a thoroughgoing skepticism. That's one of Hegel's famous lines from the book. Well, the thoroughgoing skepticism is it overturns the very skepticism that's predicated on it. Well, this is the Kantian humility argument. It's a version of that. Does that make some sense?
Right, it does, but my issue is if post-critical metaphysics does address those issues of humility, then how come those readers that are refuting it with those issues of humility, how are they actually reading it correctly?
You've reached the limits of my ability to
Okay.
defend it. Honestly, I mean, I don't know, right? And I've enjoyed my conversations with them many, 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 many times about these matters and others, right? And I've learned much from them. But I am frustrated by that question. I think ultimately it's a matter of, let's be very broad about this, right? So this helps in sort of a broad approach to Hegel. It doesn't tell us what's going on in the Actuality chapter, for example, but it helps in a broad approach to this. It's a difference between a historical approach to a figure and a contemporary appropriation of a figure. And what they're ultimately interested in, many of them, not all, they're ultimately interested in is an appropriation of that figure for contemporary conversation, insight, use, in a broad sense. And I've got no problem with that, right? I really don't. I just wish you would stop calling it Hegel, right? Why do we need to name it, right? That's an appeal to authority. Why do we need that name anymore? Just chunk that, we don't need that. So call it some, Hegelian derived, I don't care if you use, the association, but that doesn't really get you anything. The truth of the matter is in the arguments, not in the moniker that goes on top of it. But there is a way of saying, well, we'd like to appropriate Hegel for this. So it's for contemporary usage. Versus the historian, I'm more than the historian said, what did Hegel actually think? What did he take himself to be doing? So it's the difference between Aristotelian ethics and Aristotle's ethics. Here's a Hegelian metaphysics and here's Hegel's metaphysics. Right? Those are, I think, distinguishable things. We just don't tend to make that distinction like we ought to in this case. And just to add one other little bit to that, reason why I prefer the historian's approach is I don't want, and I'll go back to a term I used earlier, I really don't want to domesticate Hegel. I want him to be as weird as he possibly can, because that's when he's challenging. He's not challenging when he says what we already kind of thought was the case. When you think things are held together in this way, and they, this cause and effect, and it's mechanical, all this kind of wonderful stuff, you kind of go, yeah, I mean, now I've got some foundations for my beliefs, right, about these things. And I don't know about you, but philosophy should really strike me as something that's not palatable. That's preposterous. That to me is the mark of good philosophy. It may not be true because it's preposterous. Please don't. I didn't say that. Right? But part of its challenge to us is its initial, that can't possibly be right. I submit you back to Socrates, who often used to say, we're looking for the logos. And people would say, what the hell is that? Why do you want that? And he would say, oh, because it's it's the thing that draws all these things together and explains, gives an account of them. They go, oh, we don't have that. We can't possibly have that. Preposterous. So there's my little preposterous argument. Does that help?
Yeah.
Other comments, questions about this? Right, then let me talk about, so that's the project, and we'll come back and revisit that, right? Obviously one of the times we'll revisit it is next quarter when we look at the concept of the concept, and Hegel makes this comparison between the concept and the transcendental unity of apperception. We'll talk about that comparison. He does 3 others there, by the way, as well. None of those get mentioned. We'll talk about what those are and how those compare to what he does with them. So we'll come back to that question. All right, let's talk a little bit about the critiques of Hegel's project. This is the panlogicism critique we've talked about several times now. Schelling's claim that in Hegel, everything only exists through or by virtue of what is logical. Right? So the logic is the root of everything, and that's the master narrative, the master account, the master theory for everything else. So what the panlogicism critique basically says is that, look, Hegel and the whole rationalist tradition, of which Hegel is just the ultimate culmination, that's the way that Schelling thought about this. Panlogicism contends that Hegel necessarily fails to think being. Fails to think being. We start off the book thinking about being. He says, Schelling says, right, I know he tried to. He aspired to. But he only gave us the concept of being, not being itself. He gave us the concept of being, not being it. He didn't give us nothing, he gave us the concept of nothing. He didn't give us becoming, he gave us the concept. Right, you know how this works in that. So he didn't think existence is another way of putting it. Some people like to say that Schelling was the first existentialist. There's something to that. There's absolutely something to that, right? That existence exceeds concept. Existence exceeds conceptuality as a whole. It's not intelligible. It exceeds it. But then we can think of the other ways of terming that, the other ways of thinking about that excessiveness of what Schelling called being. We can think about it as materiality. That's what Adorno called it. We can think about it as alterity. That's what Levinas calls it. We could think about it as difference in itself, or différance, which is what Deleuze and Derrida called it. But all those are claims about how being or existence exceeds or eludes the grasp of reason. Exceeds or eludes the grasp of reason. So we talked about that in terms of the ineffable, right? That which exceeds conceptuality itself, that which exceeds. And also we talked about it in terms of the immemorial. The immemorial is that which is drawn upon, doesn't just exceed conceptuality, but it's the matrix, right, that's drawn upon to make sense of the world, but it's not included within it. So it's included by being excluded from it. It's at once included in it, it's drawn upon, right? So difference in itself, it's drawn upon, but is then excluded from the very system that are constructed upon it. And we said, well, if you think about that, that's really just variations on a theme from Schelling, this double deception, right, that he talked about, where he said, this is in his lectures, the late lectures in Munich, and they're also in Berlin. He wrote, are the categories of the logic merely subjective thoughts? Here comes his thoughts, or objective thoughts, right? Are they merely subjective thoughts masquerading? That's the deception. Masquerading as objective concepts? So this is really a book, this is the way Schelling reads the science of logic. This is a book of our ideas about being, none of which actually capture the nature of being itself. Being, this is the ineffable, right? Being exceeds. So there's this one side of the deception, right? The deception is that the subjective concepts are presented as objective concepts. They're masquerading. Then the second question he asks is the development of the categories truly immanent to them? Does Hegel really follow out a truly immanent logic? Schelling doesn't think he does. Is there an extrinsic goal of complete and utter totalization? That's what Schelling thinks he's doing, right? So everything, all this development we've been watching, we've been tracking, we've been tracing, is really, Hegel knows, right? The game is up, right? It's rigged. Already from the very beginning. He was always trying to get to this point where everything was part of one whole. And that was really the totalization that he was after from the beginning. So that drives all of the analyses. So Hegel wants to say, hey, look, this is just what this concept does. It unfolds itself into this, and look, it transforms itself into something other than itself. And damn if that doesn't transform itself. You know the story at this point. And Schelling's reading that and going, it doesn't just transform itself. It's something you may transform itself into that because you knew where the destination was. You knew where you were headed with this. You have a teleological account, account that you're really ultimately trying to serve. That's the final goal. Now, if that makes some sense, that's the immemorial and the ineffable, and that's their roots back in Schelling. We've been formulating that in conceptual terms, right, as I just did, right? We've said that the concept doesn't fully account for being. That's a simple way of putting the major point of panlogicism, right, is that being exceeds conceptuality, being exceeds rationality, being exceeds intelligibility. But we can also put that linguistically. This has come up several times. We've talked about this several times. And those two moments, the ineffable and the immemorial, are also there, and Hegel well knew these. Right? They were part of his own culture, and he had read them imminently and wrote about them. So he knew these takes on the linguistic, right? That language is exceeded by being. Right? That the terms we use in language can't actually capture the wholeness, the oneness of being itself. So Novalis and Schlegel, for example, famously say exactly that. That's why language is fundamentally and irretrievably fragmentary. We're not writing fragments because fragments are cool. We're writing fragments because language is inherently fragmentary. It's always aspiring to give us the whole, aspiring to give us the one, aspiring to give us what Kant called the idea, the totality. But it can't. Not because it's not done it well enough, not because if you gave it 3 more years, we'll get the job accomplished, because the nature of language is it can't actually capture that totality. It's inherently fragmentary. So fragmentation is the way in which this shows up, linguistic fragmentation. This is Schlegel and Novalis' claim about the nature of language. Hegel's well aware of that, right? Language is necessarily fragmentary. But what about the immemorial? Well, that means that that language has a baggage that comes with it. It has a historical tradition that it's associated with, that it's mired in, if you want to put it in that language, and it can't be pulled directly, extracted out of that. Hamann and Herder both say that, right? So they're historicists, right? They think that when you're talking about language, you're talking about the baggage that comes with it and all the associations that come with it. And those are contingent associations, my friend, right? There's no necessity in those connections. So all this necessarily entails that, this necessarily entails that. It's contingent upon a historical development that entails that. So language in that sense is contaminated with its own historicity. So the Romantics, Schlegel and Novalis, are thinkers of linguistic fragmentation, thinkers therefore of the critique of the ineffable. The historicists, Hamann and Herder, for example, saying that language is fundamentally historical. Because it's historical, then that's immemorial. You can't let go of it. It's attached to it irredeemably. Now, there's the critiques, right? Put in both conceptual terms and in linguistic terms. Make a little bit of sense? All right, so I asked this before, let me come back to it again about this question. Where do you think we're at with that? Those critiques seem plausible? Do they seem right? Do they seem mistaken? Does Hegel address those things in any kind of way? What do you think? Don't be shy. Can't be wrong. It's just a classroom. I haven't killed anybody recently. Yeah.
It seems that in articulating these critiques, what it is that's being articulated, it has to have some sort of determinate structure to it that can slip itself back into the logic. Like you can take any of this critique seriously, and it'll fail on its own terms, perhaps. Like a mini case study of that, just from what we looked at with the appearance section with the world in itself and the world of appearance, seems to be like a very relevant mini case study of what could how that binary collapses on its own terms.
This is always the kind of the frustration, right? We should acknowledge this, right? If we haven't acknowledged it yet, let's acknowledge it. That every critique, I take this away from what you're saying, so let me see if I'm getting what you're saying. Every critique we make of Hegel, every critique that's been historically made of Hegel, one of the real frustrations about it is that every time you think you've got something to say against what he's saying, or that challenges what he's saying, one of the things you can do in Hegel is say, well, yeah, he talks about that on page 45. Right? And this is the frustration, right? Is that he seems to have anticipated all the weapons to be used against him and shown them, you know, they're part of the system, they flow here, this is what they do, and here's why that doesn't work, right? Like the world in itself, the world of appearance, right? These things that we want to use and say, oh, well, being exceeds intelligibility. He goes, great, love it. Being, what is being? Glad you asked. Here's the science of life. I mean, and he will say, well, no, that's just thoughts about it. He goes, no, actually it's not. I showed you in a 400-page book. You know, so that's the frustration of it. And then he will say, well, you know, language is not up to the task. Right? This is a different way of posing the same conceptuality arguments, but now through language. Language is fragmentary. Language is historical. It can't do this stuff. And Hegel's saying, I get that. But that's under the dogmatism of assuming that language can only function representationally, that it can only be about the world, that it can't actually capture the nature of the world itself. And I get that, but it's a dogmatic assumption. We shouldn't have those, right? To be genuinely critical. This is sort of his, you know, Kantian move about everything. Let's demonstrate that everything has its warrant or not. He's a, you know, uber rationalist at this point. Everything has to be able to be demonstrated. And the Schillingian move, right, to say that there's something that exceeds conceptuality, there's something that exceeds linguistic account, right? So the conceptuality version of it, the linguistic account of it. Hegel would say, by what right? Quid juris, by what right can you make such a claim as that? Isn't already the assertion, here's the problem, right? Isn't the assertion already a commitment to the metaphysics? You know, that there's something outside conceptuality that's, you know, there. It's outside of linguistic expressibility, you know, because it's there. That's already a burgeoning metaphysical commitment that you got to own if you're going to go down those routes. And Hegel's saying, right, but if you're going down that route already, then you're committed to the idea that there's a metaphysics of that which is outside of metaphysics. And if you're going to go down that route, then you're going to say, oh, maybe we can actually know the absolute, because you appear to. Right? It's that which is outside of concepts. It's that which is outside of language. I just think, Hegel, you can give an account of that. You just think you can. Where's the dogmatic attitude there? Me saying I can, trying to lay it out, or you saying you can't, and so therefore we can't. So that's, I'm sorry to make it very caricaturish, right? The point was more sophisticated than that, I know. But I do think that that's really the conundrum we all find ourselves. I speak as a longtime reader of Hegel, and as I said, you know, when I started this class, I'm a Hegel scholar, I'm not a Hegelian, right? So what I find interesting about Hegel is the way he challenges our modes of thought. Not because I think he's right about everything, because I don't know. But what he is challenging about for us is that every time we try to find something to critique against him, he seems to have some criticism of that. So we got to up our game. If we're going to engage with these texts in a very, not just understand the text, that's hard enough, we all know that, right? But also be critical about our understanding of it. That's really a hard challenge. You've just seen some of the historical figures who tried to have responses to people and the struggle they're having with as a result. Comments, questions, things you want to say to that? Yeah.
I guess on the nature of some of the critiques we've visited already, I mean, at least for me, it's sort of difficult to think these things because on evaluating them on Hegel's terms, you do sort of get into this morass, or this, I don't know, sort of in the circle where you can always be redirected back into the text. And at least for me, looking at like Deleuze and Derrida, Deleuze's critique seems to hinge on, you know, identifying the phenomenological moment that happens with diversity, difference, which is, I mean, whether that bears itself out in text is a different issue. But I know for Derrida, and maybe not so much the way he critiques Hegel in terms of difference and like the teleological constriction of negation or difference, right? But in later texts, the way he talks about it is not so much that, oh, I think there's something ontologically wrong with Hegel's argument, or maybe that is the way he talks about it, to rephrase it. But it's always about what is the consequences of Hegel's system as a totalizing force in terms of positing an absolute difference. So the critique never seems to be borne out with, identifying something in Hegel's logic. What really seems at risk, at least for someone like Derrida, which is I'm a little more familiar with that one, so that's why I'm talking about it, is what you're left with at the end of Hegel's logic, right? That you're left with this all-consuming totality from which nothing can necessarily escape, and you can't necessarily posit something different out of it, or that how do I want to phrase this? You run up against a limit, the limit of whether that's sublation or the limit of absolute difference, and how do you get necessarily out of that? And so for me, it's like Derrida's concern is always what's left over after Hegel's system.
I think that's exactly right, and I think that points us in a different direction than I've taken us thus far, right? So it's really important to consider this as well. And that is to say, one way of approaching these questions is to say, let's just see if the ontological stuff is right? Is he right about being? Is he right about differences? Is he right about that sort of stuff? We can also look at the linguistic dimension. Is language up to the task of systematicity? That's a way of thinking about that. But another way, you're quite right, is to say, and this is not just Derrida, right? I would say this is true in Deleuze, this is true in Levinas, this is true in Adorno, and many, many other thinkers as well. That they're worried about what I would call the ethical implications, the ethical political implications of totalization. That they think totalization is on the way towards, it's not equatable with totalitarianism. That it at least leads towards that because it says everything is fully rationalizable. And if everything's fully rationalizable, then we can control everything. Because the notion of reason there, this is from the Frankfurt School in particular, is if we can know it, then we can control it. And if we can know everything, then we can control literally everything. It's domination, oppression. This is the dialectic of enlightenment argument, right, in a nutshell. And so this is, I think, not an ontological criticism, which Adorno, for example, in negative dialectics makes, right? But this is an ethical political criticism of a full-blown, humbled rationalism, right? Which they think Hegel is but the greatest example of, but there's a lot of others that aspire, right, to the same kind of life. And I think that's a very different kind of critique, right? A very, very different kind of critique. There's a lot of things we can talk about there, the assumptions that are made about the nature of rationality, and fine, but that's a very different kind of approach to Hegel, right? Foucault famously said, every time we tried to escape Hegel, there he was at the end of the avenue that we picked and thought we could escape from, right? He always showed up at the end of those. That is the kind of frustration, right? You can never escape from Hegel, it seems, because of this kind of stuff. But this kind of critique, right, is one of the ways in which that attempted to be done, absolutely. And that's not, we're not addressing that here in the science of lecture. Yeah, so thank you for that. Yeah.
It seems that that critique does have at least an ontological interpretation insofar as it maybe is taking issue with there being no novelty or something like that. That the system gets rid of novelty, but novelty is an ontological feature that we continue to discover. Or I think this is related to a question Alex asked many sessions ago about apodicticity, and you have a different account of that than many other people do. But it does seem that there could be an ontological dimension at stake in that as well.
No, I agree with that. I think there's more at stake there than I'm laying out these critiques from the ontological side. There's more at stake there, and there's also ontological dimensions of this ethical political critique as well. That's exactly. Yeah.
And I guess this is more of a broad question based off of, do you think it would be fair to say that, Deleuze and maybe Derrida, because that's where the question's heading, they base that identifying the problem with difference or contradiction in the moment of diversity, right, between absolute difference and absolute identity, if I'm calling that correctly. And that comes out of Hippolyte, I believe, in Logic and Existence, or at least that's where he talks about. I imagine they got it in lectures and all sorts of other places. But at least that their critiques are borne out on an ontological claim that Hippolyte is making about the speculative moment of Hegel's logic. So it's not stuff it's completely distanced from.
No, I would say, what I'm trying to say is that there is this dimension of they want to just take it on frontally and say, so there's a moment in Difference and Repetition where Deleuze says, what we want is difference in itself. Now, he's not stupid, right? He knows what difference in itself means. It comes out of the logic, right? It's one of the places that it comes from. He immediately follows it up by saying, not diversity. Okay, thanks for the flag. I know if you know, right? If you know Hippolyte, if you know the science of logic, you know what he's referring to. This is what he's. So we want to try to give an account of that. So he's doing flat out, let's just do ontology, right? At that moment, right? At that moment. So, and Derrida will do something similar. The interviews in Positions, for example, where he's talking about this. He says, and he does this in Glas as well, but he's talking about this very issue. He takes it on just in terms of, well, is that the nature of difference, or is that reducible, right, down to contradiction? So, yeah. But I think that there is this other dimension, right, that they both also think is tied up with this, which is what I call broadly an ethico-political critique of this as well. You see it in Adorno, you see it in Levinas, you see it in all the others as well. So they're worried about totalization, not just as a matter of full-blown rationalism, but the consequences of a full-blown rationalism for the disaster to the earth. I'm paraphrasing Adorno and Horkheimer in Dialectic Enlightenment, that produces. Because to know is to master. So yeah, I think they're both. Make some sense? Then let me take a few minutes here to do what I've done last time, and that is kind of reconstruct the overarching sort of diagram of where we're at in the science of logic, and then bear down on a place where we've reached, and that's the notion of actuality. So let me put it together this way. So, being, essence, just relation for the moment, process. So if you look at the logic of essence, right, the essence logic, you'll see that being is initially determined as shine, right? Shine. Guise. And that means that essence is initially determined as the essential, the depth, and their relationship to one another, the process that gives rise to both of them, is this notion of reflection. And we know he looks at reflection in terms of positing, extraneous, and determining reflection. Having done this initial setup, right, since the very beginning of the book of the Doctrine of Essence, he then says, well, let's look at what essence is, right? So reflecting back from the measurelessness of shine, which is really what shine is. Shine is nothing other than a name for the measurelessness of the qualitative and quantitative determinations of being. So you can think about quality, quantity, and their measurelessness. That's what shine is. Right? So it's the guise, and that reflects us back to, right, this is where the truth of being is essence. Reflects us back to essence. And then we say, well, what is essence? Well, essence is identity. Right? That means it's different than difference. But that ultimately ends up in contradiction. Now, this is really critical for the essence logic, as I've said many times now. In contradiction, we learn that essences are two things. They have two dimensions to them. And I want to hold on to both of these because they both play out throughout the rest of the essence logic. So it's important to get both of them, so let me just reassert them. So when we say that essence is contradiction, that it is itself by virtue of not being itself, that difference is not extraneous to it, but the difference is literally built into it itself. So it is itself by not being itself. It is itself and not itself at the same time. Then that renders essence null and void. It's nothing unto itself. So as I've said many times in the text, it's worth stopping at that moment and realizing the kind of profundity of what that claim is. Hegel is literally saying there are no essences in themselves. Just no such thing as that, right? Conceptually, not because he doesn't like them, not because I've explored the domain of the Platonic heaven. No, it's just not possible on its own terms, because to be an identity, which is a minimal requirement for an essence to be an essence, to be something in itself, identity is necessarily not itself. And because it's not itself, it's nothing, it's destroyed, it's null, it's void. Now that'll come back repeatedly in just a minute, so I'd like to hold on to that. But the other thing he says about it is not only that it's null, but it's also the ground. Well, what does that mean? It means that it others itself and gives rise to something from it. What is that it gives rise to? It gives rise to Erscheinung, appearance. Now we have being as appearance. We have essence as ground. In between them, we have now the appearing, or he also calls it the founding, grounding. So far, so good, right? We come back to being now. Essence is the ground, but there's nothing of essence in itself. So it's null and void, and because it's null and void, it others itself. But by othering itself, it posits, it grounds being now. We can speak of now, Irshana, appearance is grounded being, right? Concrete existence. These are all the terms he uses for them interchangeably. It means they're tethered to something that's not themselves. So being is now all this measureless qualitative and quantitative determinations. Now I've got a measure. The measure is essence. And you think, oh good, we're finished, we're done. The problem, of course, is that does make essence what it is. It now provides a function. It's the grounding function for everything that exists. But, dirty little secret, essence is nothing unto itself. That hasn't stopped, right? You didn't say, oh, now it's got something into itself. No, it doesn't have anything into itself. It's still a contradiction. Because it's a contradiction, it's null and void. So when we go through all these various, what he calls the essential relations, when he talks about, I always forget the first one. Yeah, the thing and its properties. We talk about the world in itself, the world of appearance. And when he talks about the whole, parts, we talk about force and expression. And finally, when we talk about inner and outer, which we'll again come back to as we did last time, we find what he calls the essential relation. The essential relation is a relation of grounding. The properties are grounded in the thing. The world of appearance is grounded in the world in itself. The parts are grounded in the whole. The expression is grounded in the force. The outer is grounded in the inner. And so this whole side, thing, world in itself, whole, force, inner, is the essence for these, the being side, parts, properties, world of appearance, parts, expression, outer. But what you find when you go through all those grounding relationships, the essential relations, when you go through all of them, what do you find out? You find out the truth that's always been lingering there. And what's that? The essence side is nothing unto itself. What is the thing that the properties are grounded in? What is the world in itself that the world of appearance is grounded in? What is the whole that the parts are grounded in? And so forth and so on. What is it? The answer is nothing unto themselves. Absolutely every time that you go from the grounded parts to the whole grounding, what do you find the ground to be? Nothing unto itself. It's just the parts. It's just the properties. It's just the appearance. It's just the expression. So what the essential relation demonstrates is that the essence-being relationship looks like it's one of grounding, where being is grounded in essence. But because essence is what it is, namely fundamentally contradiction, it grounds, right? It negates itself and grounds that which is other than. It relates itself to that which is other than. And becomes itself in so doing. But it becomes itself functionally, not substantively. Functionally, it tethers, it holds them all together. But it has nothing into itself. That's what thing is, that's what world in itself is, that's what the whole is, the force is, the inner is. It's something that holds the other side together. It anchors it, to use the language from Plato. But it has nothing into itself. In fact, it's still null and void. That's why every time you look for the thing, you find its properties, and there is nothing other than its properties. The thing is just the assembly of its properties. World of appearance, you just find the world in itself is nothing other than the world of appearance. The parts are the whole, the expression is the force, the outer is the inner. There is nothing over and above. So where does that bring us? It brings us at the end of that account, take a look with me again, we were here last week, but let me take us here just again, to this insight. This is on page, this is page 464. He writes this. So just This is his first of a couple. We're going to get more of these in the Actuality chapter. But here's his first one, right, where he just wants to say, okay, look, here's what we've shown. Here's the fallout from everything we've investigated up to this point. Here's what he says. Therefore, what something is, that it is entirely in its externality, its othering of itself, right? What something is, it is other than itself. Its externality is its totality, and equally so, its unity reflected into itself. Its appearance is not only reflection into an other, it doesn't just become other than itself, but it's also reflection into itself, immanent reflection. And its externality is therefore the expression of what it is in itself. Now catch that term there he's introduced, expression. We've been thinking about this relationship between being and essence as a matter of appearing. He's just now said, look, appearance is the language that's appropriate to what? Grounds. Where essence grounds being. So we can say that essences must appear. Because to be an essence is to be nothing other than, because there's nothing other than two essences, then they're appearing, they're giving rise to something, they're grounding of something other than themselves. Whether that's the thing in the properties, the world in itself, and the world of appearance, and so forth. All those are appearing relationships. But at the end of that, what do we find? There's nothing in the inner that's left over. There's nothing left behind. The inner just is the outer. The essence just is being. So what does that mean? It means this is a relationship of expression. This is his first term for what he's about to call manifestation. Right? So this is an interim term between appearance and manifestation. That's going to be the big distinction. We'll talk more about it in just a moment. But he's saying here this. Notice what he says. And its externality is therefore the expression of what it is in itself. And since in its content and its form are thus absolutely identical, the argument he's just made in inner and outer, right, is that there is no inner that isn't outer in terms of its form, in terms of its content. Both are just moments of one totality. So he says, it is in and for itself nothing but this, expressing itself. Now, notice what's interesting about that. When we started the Doctrine of Essence, we said what? We said being reflects itself into essence. Being reflects itself into essence. And now we've said, at a certain point along the way, we said essence appears in being. So far, so good? So one side related to the other side. One relata related to the other relata, right? Here, reflection, we move back from being to essence. So we move back, we reflect back. That's why that language is appropriate. We do so in terms of positing extrinsic and determining reflection. But once we see what an essence is, we know that that essence necessitates that it become, that it appear. It can't remain unto itself because of its contradictory nature. Then it has to appear. Now essence is appearing. But what's borne out by the negativity that's inhabited within essence? Hegel says repeatedly here, this isn't being with non-being, this is non-being in being itself. So it's non-being within essence itself. This nullity, this voidness is incredibly important. It doesn't go away. And what that means is that this hierarchy of thing as the ground of properties of the world in itself over the world of appearance, on the whole over the parts, the force of expression, inner over the outer, that hierarchical relationship undermines itself. It can't hold. So all you really have here is not one side being grounded in the other, one side being reflected back into the other. What you have here is just simply expression going on. Now, Hegel loves this because he thinks he's got a term that allows him to say what the relation between the two is without committing to one or the other sides being the agent of that relation, the doer of the relation. Being doesn't reflect back into essence. Essence doesn't appear in being. All we have going on here is expression is happening. So he says, and since its content and its form are thus absolutely identical, it is in and for itself nothing but this, to express itself, or expressing itself. It is the revealing of its essence, and this essence, accordingly, consists simply in being self-revealing. So there's nothing to essence over and above, beyond its expression of itself. Well, where does it get expressed? In its properties, in its world of appearance, in the parts. in the outer. The essential relation, which is the designator for these hierarchical grounding relations we've been exploring, in this identity of appearance with the inner or with essence, has determined itself. I didn't make this up. This is the way this thing actually dictated that we go. I'm just tracking. Has determined itself as actuality. So he's going to tell us in just a moment that being is actuality. Wirklichkeit, German. And he will also say that essence is actuality. They're both moments of actuality. And what are they doing? They're expressing. They're moments of expression. What he's about to call moments of manifestation. What he also calls here revelation. Revealing himself, showing himself, displaying himself, expressing himself. Notice, the reason he wants all these terms is because they're not bound to, tethered to one side or the other. It's not essence doing this, it's not being doing this, it's this happens, and you get these two sides. So far it makes some sense? Now, what that then allows him to do is to explore, well, what do we then mean by the totality of which all these things are moments? What do we mean by actuality? That's why the last chapter is about actuality. Because he wants to say actuality is the name for, being in essence in their unity with one another as moments of expression, moments of manifestation, moments of revelation. Now, he defines it this way at a certain point. Take a look at this. So take a look on, this is on page 477, beginning of chapter 2 of the Actuality chapter, also helpfully titled Actuality, 380 in the German. He says this about it. Top of that page. The absolute is the unity of inner and outer. So this is one of those moments where Hegel's just going back and rehearsing. Here's what I've shown, right? Let's be clear. Actuality, for reasons we'll talk about in just a moment, he's coming back and rehearsing this argument. Let's unpack the argument again. The absolute is the unity of inner and outer as a first implicitly existent unit. Now you ought to know by this point, first implicitly existent unit is highlighted for you, italicized for you, because Hegel's saying it's not going to stay like that. But that's where we begin. The exposition appeared as an external reflection, which for its part has the immediate as something it has found. Well, it sounds like we're back in external reflection, something like that. That's what it sounds like. But it equally is its movement and the reference or relation connecting it to the absolute. And as such, it leads it back to the latter, determining as a mere way and manner. Way and manner is his phrase for the mode, the modality of it, which is what he's about to talk about as modality. Modus is where he's talking about the mode. Right? He's borrowing this from Spinoza, but not using it the way that Spinoza did. But mode. So he's saying, but this way and manner, this mode, is the determination of the absolute itself, namely its first identity or its merely implicit existent unity. So that can't be what it ultimately is, but it is what we've shown that it is thus far. We'll come back and look at this argument. And through this reflection, not only is this first in itself posited as essenceless determination, but since the reflection is negative self-relation, it is through it that the in itself becomes a mode in the first place. It is this reflection that in sublating itself in its determinations and as a movement that as such turns back upon itself is first truly absolute identity, and at the same time the determining the absolute or its modality. The mode, therefore, is the externality of the absolute, but equally so only its reflection into itself. Or again, so he thinks these all be equivalent. What am I saying? It is the absolute's own manifestation. So here's where he's invoking this notion of, it's not the absolute appearing. So the absolute isn't the ground, right, that shows itself in something else. That would be to put us back in the essential relation. Now we would be like the absolute is the thing, or it's the world itself, or it's the whole, it's the force, it's the inner. It's none of those, he's saying. It's not an essential relation. It's its own manifestation. He says about that, So that this externalization, it's becoming other than itself. It's being a mode. And therefore, is its immanent reflection, and therefore its being in and for itself. So as the manifestation that it is nothing, that it has no content, save to be the manifestation of itself, the absolute is absolute form. Okay, I don't know what that means, right? But he's starting to talk about manifestation as though it was now the key term, and it is. Look at how he talks about it here on, now I'm skipping a little bit around to make these points. I'll come back and look at the material in between in just a moment. Take a look at page 489. This is chapter 3 of the Actuality chapter, absolute relation, contrasted with the essential relation, right? Now we have the absolute relation. He's just worked through this notion of necessity, absolute necessity in particular, which we're going to work through fairly carefully. These paragraphs that you see on 485 over to 488 are some of the toughest in the entire book. Yeah, it's a hard book. This is probably some of the toughest material in the entirety of the book. We're going to work through those paragraphs in just a little bit. But what he says after that is this: absolute necessity is not so much the necessary, even less a necessary, but necessity. You want to say, what's the point? Why are you making this thing that's not the necessary, so it's not a thing, or even a necessary, it's not a necessary thing. What is it? It's just necessity. Being simply as reflection. It is relation. Notice here he goes through it. It's a relation. Because it is in differing itself, you have in distinguishing those moments, in differentiating, unterscheiden, right? It's differentiating itself. Whose moments are themselves the whole totality of necessity, and their subsist absolutely, but do so in such a way that their subsisting is one subsistence, and the difference only the reflective shine of the movement of exposition. And this reflective shine is the absolute itself. So what is he saying? The absolute is manifestation? Yeah. So the absolute's not being, it's not essence. It's the process, the relation initially, between the two. It's not one appearing in the other. It's not one expressing itself in the other. It's expression as such, manifestation as such. And one final piece of this, take a look on this page. So back up here, 478 again. Just to round out this thought, then I'll turn to the other side of it. This is 478, top of the page, 381 in the German. Take a look about 4 lines down. Hegel very rarely gets this assertive, right? We've seen it. He's, clause after clause, buried sentence after buried, clause after clause, right? He's nuancing and it's unpacking this, and he says it in some kind of weird way. Here's where he says something that's very, very outright straight. The problem is how do you deal with this conceptually? What does this actually mean? But he's very clear, I think, about what he's saying. He says this: we've reached actuality, right? So he's reminding us we've gotten to actuality. Then he defines actuality this way: the actual is therefore manifestation. It's a beautiful short sentence in Hegel. There are precious few of these, right? But a lot is packed into that. Right? The actual is manifestation. And look at what he says about it. He's still talking about the actual, is not drawn into the sphere of alteration by its externality. Now, you want to stop at that moment and go, is Hegel serious? Does he expect me to remember that 400 pages before this, he talked about how being was drawn into alteration by its externality, being with non-being? Yeah, that's what he's doing. He's saying, this manifestation is not alteration. It's not being, it's afflicted with non-being and therefore has to alter and change. Yeah, that's a higher level display of this, a higher level instantiation of this, but it is not equivalent. He then says, just to push you on a little further, it is not drawn into the sphere of alteration by its externality, nor is it the reflected shining of itself in another. So this isn't the way being works, right? This isn't the way reflection works either. Manifestation is not reducible, equatable to either alteration or to reflection. Well, what is it? He says, it just manifests itself. There's nothing being manifested other than manifestation itself. That's it. And this means that in its externality, and only in it, I love that moment, right? Because that's Hegel saying, in case you thought there was some, essence left over that could, do some work for us and, be something unto itself. No. only in it, in its externality, is it itself. That is to say, in case you didn't get my point, only as a self-differentiating and self-determining movement. So if you ask Hegel, what's the absolute? He will say, it's actuality. And you will say, great, actuality. He'll say, no, actually not. That's part of actuality, absolutely, part of actuality. Period. But it's not what I mean by actuality. Actuality is, as he just said, the manifestation of itself. Well, what is itself? Nothing other than its manifestation. Well then, what's actuality? Everything. Everything. Because all of its manifestation. Everything. Well, then it's not that thing or this thing? Nope. It's not a thing. It's not something that is manifested. It's not what is manifested, it's just the manifesting itself. And that means that it's just this movement, as he just said, of self-differentiation and self-determination at the same time. Now, I submit that that's the core of Hegel's ontology. We'll specify it in more detail here in just a few minutes. But if you want to push Hegel to, what's the nature of reality? It's a process of self-differentiating, self-determining movement. That's it. There is no overarching essence. There is no overarching absolute. This is the absolute. The absolute is manifestation. It just is this process and nothing else other than this process. Now, if that makes some sense, give me just a few minutes to set up what we'll do in the actuality chapter, and then we'll explore how that manifestation takes place in terms of its modality this week, and then we'll look at its causality next week, because that's really what Hegel does in these chapters, right? Is look at the modal question first. We look at four concepts of modality. We look at possibility, actuality, but we also look at contingency and necessity. So he does the modal side of it. I'm going to call that the form. He doesn't call it that, so be cautious about that term. The form of its manifestation, how it manifests. How it manifests. The form. And then the causality discussion, again, he doesn't call it this, I call it this, it's a pedagogically useful, I think, distinction to make. The causality is the content of manifestation. It's what's manifesting. It is just this process, causality. So give me just a moment to set up the actuality chapter, and then we'll be done. I have an outline of what I just went through. I do it in premise conclusion form on the, not on the handout, but on D2L. It's called the master argument of the objective logic. I love master arguments. That's me trying to back out and say, what the hell's going on here? Right? And that's for me. Right? All these handouts, all the charts start with me trying to make sense of stuff. And if I think it might be helpful to you, that's when I can give it to you. So that's what that is. That's me literally sitting around, trying to figure out what's going on in the science of logic, right? Because I'm afflicted with that not being, right? I'm afflicted with that illness. And this is the master argument as I understand it, right? And it tries to attach it to these three claims: the truth of being is essence, essence must appear, and actuality is the unity of essence in concrete existence, right? So those are the three key moments. It doesn't give you an explication of actuality there, right? So what we're about to do. All right. Let me talk a little bit about the actuality chapter opening, and then we'll take a break and we'll come back and look at the modality chapter, chapter 2. So Hegel says, look, that if we're going to talk about actuality, then we have to think of it in these terms as we're now at the level of the absolute. The absolute he initially defines as nothing other than, as he just called it here, the essential unit of the identity of essence and existence, essence and being. That's what we've gotten to. That's what this names, right? Actuality names all of that relationship itself and the two moments. But as always in Hegel, we've learned this at this point. Once you've gotten to an identity, you need to be concerned. Right? Because identities are always what? Determinlessness. Right? They're undifferentiated, they're indifferent, they have no determinations about them. And that's exactly what he says about the absolute. It's void. It's null, has nothing to it. Why? Because what makes it what it is, namely the process of expression, what we're about to call the process of manifestation, is not intrinsic to it. It's the unity of being in essence, being in essence without the process that generates both of them. So that stands outside of them. So he says, that's the absolute we're talking about. An absolute that's void, as he says. This is on page 466, 370 in the German. It's the dwelling place, he calls it there, of determinatenesses. All of them are born within the absolute. But it is itself, it's an absolute identity, indeterminate. He, at one point, literally calls it the negation of all predicates. The void. So this should, sound familiar to us. We've been here. This is what nothing was, right? And being nothing becoming. This is what quality, when it becomes fully and completely itself, it's rendered indifferent to itself, becomes magnitude, right? When magnitude goes to its completion, it's the quality-quantity relationship, but that's ultimately borne out in terms of what? Measurelessness. So always when we get these two moments and they're related to one another, the initial relation of them to one another is an identification. And that initial identification is always, by virtue precisely of that identification, which follows. Hegel's not critiquing this, he's saying this is what follows. But what follows is, then they are indifferent. They are the difference that makes no difference, right? They are a relation that has now been so identified that they don't have any determinacy of their own. So at that point, this is where this language comes in. He says, well, that's not the absolute absolute. Why? Because what makes the moments, the process of expression, as we call it at this point, reflection, to use the older term for it, which he uses here as well, it's extrinsic to the absolute. It's extrinsic to the absolute. Because it's extrinsic, then there's something that's not in the absolute. The absolute is not absolute if it doesn't incorporate everything. Well, it doesn't incorporate the very thing that gives rise to it, the very process that gives rise to it. So the absolute then turns out to be only a particular moment, an attribute of the genuine totality. So the absolute is not absolute. The absolute is an attribute of a broader and more encompassing whole. So he starts calling the absolute as a determination of the whole. He calls it an absolute attribute. An absolute attribute. So you remember in Spinoza, right, that the absolute has two attributes. You can argue about whether that's for us or in itself, right? There's different ways of interpreting Spinoza on this question. But thought and extension, right? Thought and extension. Surprise, surprise. Spinoza was a Cartesian, right? It's thought and extension. So you've got these two moments, they're parallel to one another. We all know all the problems in the text of the ethics about this, but that's the claim. So Hegel's not picking up all that metaphysical baggage, he's picking up that notion of attribute. So what's an attribute? The essential property that defines the absolute as what it is. But now the absolute is itself the essential property of some more encompassing totality, some more encompassing whole, of which it's an attribute. So even the absolute is not absolute. Well, then what is it? Well, it's this more encompassing whole. Can't just be an attribute, it's got to be a mode. A mode. It's a way, as you said just a moment ago. I mean, he's picking this up from Spinoza as well, but it's not Spinoza's usage of attribute-mode distinction. Right? Modes are what we see, right, of the thought extension attributes in Spinoza. That's not his claim. He's not saying, oh, well, we see the absolute as a mode. No, he's saying it exists as. This way of existing is as. That's why he uses this language of way, right? All the time. How a way. It's a mode. And that allows him to say, well, then we need to think about this in two ways. We need to think about it in terms of its modality, how it is, and that's its modal status. But we also need to think about what it is. Not just how it is, but what it is. The what it is its content. So I think a useful way of posing the question here is this. If the absolute is only understandable in terms of two things, only is two things, that is, it's how and it's what, by terms, its form and its content, then what is that form and content? Well, the form is its modality, its modus, how it exists. And that means, does it exist as actual? Well, yeah, it's actuality. Well, then what's its relationship to possibility? And what's the relationship with that to, necessity and contingency? There's the modality question. That's the how of its existence. But then the what of its existence is, okay, now, what does it do? We know it's expressing, but what's the nature of expressing? How does expression work? And that's the account of causality, which is going to give. Initially in terms of substance accident, but ultimately in terms of cause and effect and reciprocity. So we'll get to all those. If you've been through the first critique, you should go, I think I recognize those, they're in the categories. They are, but Kant didn't do this. He didn't actually show how one entails the next. This is Hegel's critique of Kant's robbing these from the table of categories, the table of categories of judgment, table of judgments, taking it over to the categories and just saying, that'll work. That's the guiding clue. And Hegel says, you actually got to show how those entail each other. This is what he's not doing. So what is the modality? Well, the modality is this actuality, and we're going to talk about it in terms of those 4 categories of modality initially. We're going to look at it in terms of possibility, actuality, and then contingency and necessity. And here's what I'll leave you with, and we'll take a break and come back to it. The way he's going to work through this is he's going to say the following. If you want to think about essence in its modal dimension, essence in its modal dimension, as a moment within this process of manifestation, this process of the absolute, then you want to think about it in terms of possibility. Possibility. And you need to think about this side being in terms of actuality. Now actuality doesn't name the whole, it names one of the modal moments. It names one of the modal moments, that which is actual, that which exists. And you'll say, oh, I get it. We get back essence here, right? Because it's a possibility. And what do we mean by possibility? Glad you asked. We have 3 different determinations of each one of these, right? No surprise. The first determination of possibility is that which is not contradictory. Well, that's a problem, because essences are inherently contradictory. So that can't possibly work out. We'll see how that gets taken up. But then how do these relate to one another? What's the nature of their relationship? Well, you can say, well, that's about manifestation or revelation. Absolutely is. But Hegel's going to work through this in terms of its modality, in terms of necessity and contingency. And here's for you to think about during the break. Hegel's going to make the following 2 claims. He's going to make many more, but let's talk about 2 of the most preposterous, 2 of the most perplexing, just to begin with. He's going to say that contingency is necessity. That it's necessary that things be contingent. That it's necessary that things be contingent. And then he's going to say, also, that necessity actually is contingency. Contingency actually is necessity. Now, come on. That's nuts. We all know what contingency at least means, right? Contingency means that it could be otherwise. And necessity means could not be otherwise. Right? So, come on. They're not the same thing. And it's nuts to say that contingency is a necessary feature of the world. Hegel's going to make that claim. And then he's going to turn around from that and actually argue that necessity, because of that, is contingency, and contingency actually is necessity itself. It's what he calls absolute necessity. We'll have to make sense of those crazy, preposterous claims. We'll do so after the break. Let's take about a 10-minute break, 4:50, we'll be back then. See you then.